were not serving.
So you mean that before this law that they didn't have, we couldn't get access to that information?
Exactly. Before this law.
Even a parent. If I had my child in there, I couldn't say, I want to know.
And the reason was
what
that you could find out something about your individual child, but what you could not find out is this law requires that the school systems break out their student population by minority groups, by the poverty students, and so forth, and then show the results of the teaching to those kids by group. And before that, a lot of school systems, like say Arlington, which has a very wealthy population and some very poor people as well, they would often group their statistics together in such a way that they said, see, we're serving our students so well in Arlington. Well, that means they just hid the failures within the overall larger picture of, and granted, for most middle class and higher class kids in Arlington, the school systems do an adequate job, relatively speaking, but minority parents especially were just furious about how the failures of the system were not being adequately shown, and No Child Left Behind had to be a federal law to force systems to do that in a systematic way. So it's not just about how kids get tested and so forth. It's about accountability and transparency.
Well,
and it's in the service of democracy.
As far as accountability, I mean, that is for the claims made in favor of the act. We have here, more progress was made by 9-year-olds in reading in the last 5 years than in the previous 28 years combined. We had Americans' 9-year-olds posted the best scores in reading since 1971 and math since 1973. In the history of the report, America's 13-year-olds earned the highest math scores ever recorded. Reading and math scores for African American and Hispanic 9-year-olds reached an all-time high, while the achievement gaps in reading and math between white and African American 9-year-olds and between white and Hispanic 9-year-olds are at an all-time low. So that would definitely seem that is a concern of yours that's being answered by these.
Well, it does, and it does seem to make some sense, right? That if you have a law where the school systems now have to, in a very visible way, show exactly whether their systems are working for the poor and minority kids as well as for the average and wealthy kids, then more resources are going to have to be. I mean, they're going to be embarrassed. More resources have to be devoted to those folks. They don't want to fail anybody. The school system doesn't want to fail anybody, but they have to be forced to put those resources. It's a little bit similar to, in the United States, we had to pass a national law to force chemical companies to reveal to their communities about what kind of disaster toxic gas cloud they could put into the community. The companies were not sharing that information with the local fire chiefs and citizens until we passed a federal law to force them to do it.
But those were private corporations,
well,
not
sure, that's right.
I mean, the schools are run by the government. I mean, what we pay taxes for, and they're supposed to be held accountable to us.
Right. Now, see, that gets back to a more basic question is, one of the first things I learned as an educational sociologist is a school system exists to turn out the kinds of product that society wants. If society wants a very, say, militarized kind of a person, there'll be a lot of military academies. If the society wants a person who's going to be very skilled in a narrow technical skill, there'll be a bunch of technical schools. If society wants kids to be educated for democracy, there'll be a lot of education about what democracy really means and how to get it.
Such as like the civics courses, which that would go into the, that it's basically standardizing everybody, that there's no individuality.
Right. As far as things like a well-rounded education, the No Child Left Behind Act, because resources are being put into literacy and numeracy, basically those skills like writing and reading or arithmetic, funds are being drawn away from things like civics and science and physical education. Those things that we associated with that we didn't once associate as being extra are now really pushed to the margins of the school, because school districts are forced to produce numbers in an ever increasing numbers so that they can maintain their federal funding. If a school district does not produce, then they're subject to losing schools. They're subject to losing resources, and so they spend a great deal of the school year on testing. There are some states like Connecticut where 30% of the school days in the year are spent actually sitting for those tests. And that doesn't include the time in preparation for the test.
And that would go into the American Heart Association and the National Association for Sport and Physical Education said that because of the diminishing physical education in school, because of the No Child Left Behind, that it is contributing to the rising levels of childhood obesity.
Not only things like that, but in special education, when I first started teaching special education, the push was to mainstream students into regular ed classes so as to give those kids a least restrictive atmosphere in which to learn. That doesn't necessarily accommodate the better test scores. So many times these kids are pulled out for an extra amount of time away from the regular classroom, away from the mainstream classroom, in order to increase the time they're preparing for an exam.
But don't those kids would need extra time to prepare them?
Right, but what they're not, in what they're gaining in being able to pass this exam in reading and in mathematics, they're losing in things like being able to deal with socially with their peers, being exposed to things outside of those two subject areas.
Should schools, I mean, basically in the math and in the reading, they're doing great. Paula's saying, but that's it, and that life is more than that, and teaching is more than just
sure it is, but
reading and math.
Much of my perspective comes from working with minority parents, and that means mainly Hispanic and African American parents in Northern Virginia, and their kids were not doing well in schools. I mean, there is an achievement gap between whites and Asians on the one hand, and blacks and Hispanics on the other hand, and it has been an achievement gap for a long time, decades, and so. If you're a parent from the minority group, you do put a real emphasis. You want the school system to be, let's say, focused on providing those children with reading and arithmetic. And if they have to sacrifice some other parts of the school system in order to do that, imagine trying to tell a minority parent, well, we're going to make sure your kid gets art and music and whatnot, even if they don't learn to read by the 3rd grade. I mean, that doesn't wash. That is not an attractive political proposition to